let's see, and then everybody else. Lisa, obviously we all know that Lisa is the author of the book we're talking about tonight, and without words, it's been a long day, my mind's blanking out. So let's go through, and if everybody else wants to introduce yourself. Dana?
I have known Lisa for a few years. I had no idea that she was writing a book, and I saw on Facebook once that she wrote one, and I bought it, and I read it, and I loved it.
It's a good book, yeah. Well, welcome. Roxy?
Yeah, that's a great segue, because Dana is a friend of mine, and she said, Roxy, you have family from South Dakota, right? I said, yes. She's like, oh, you should read this book. And so I did, and it was great.
Fantastic. And so you kind of recognize some of the places, I bet.
I did.
Cool.
I did.
You need to tell the story.
Well, maybe that's part of the discussion part.
Christine?
Hi, it's Christy. I met Lisa through AFS, and Dana, I know you as well. Long time since I've seen you. Yeah. My mom grew up in South Dakota. I have a lot of family there, so it meant a lot to read Lisa's book.
Okay. And Miriam?
Hi, I've known Lisa for, oh boy, Lisa, how many years has it been now? 12, 15 years about from church, and with the connection with friends living in South Dakota and with Lisa, I just kind of put the two and two together, and it was time. I mean, there was times I couldn't put the book down. I had to keep on going. But oh, it's 2 o'clock. I maybe should go to bed. It's 2 a.m. So, hey, but it was just like awesome book.
That's what an author wants to hear. And then Susan?
I'm Susan Adler. Lisa and I have been friends for years and years. Been on vacation together several times. And I actually read the book before it was published. She had sent me the manuscript so that I could kind of read through it and see what I thought. And I made just a few very minor suggestions. And so it's been a while since I've read the book, but I have.
Can you guys hear me now?
We
can see you.
Yay. I should maybe.
So, Lisa, do you want to give, Lisa, can you hear me?
I can hear you, but I have 2 videos going now, so I'm trying to close the other one.
Oh, okay. Okay.
That's just left me. So how do I leave the meeting?
I could disconnect you, I believe.
If you connect, disconnect Lisa Bonin Norby.
Oh, okay, let's see.
And that way then I'm not echoing on 2 computers. Sorry about this. It's worked fine. I don't know what's wrong with my computer. It probably just needs to be restarted.
Okay, I put you in the waiting room.
All right, good.
There you go.
Good, that's better. That's better.
So, Lisa, do you want to give us a little bit of first your background as a writer? And I'll explain really quick for everybody. This is our second week doing this, and we have lined up, I think, through June 1st or June 8th. I don't remember if there's anyone after Sean right now. Oh, there is. I know there's one because my sister's birthday is June 8th, so I do remember that. And so our plan is to continue this if there's interest. And so what we do is we get together exactly as we are now, and each week there will be an author, and people can join for as many authors as they want. If they want, every week, that's great. We hope people will recommend it, and usually we'll have the author. There might be 1 or 2 cases where we're not able to, where the author can't make it. And then we just kind of talk about the book. You're welcome to come even if you haven't read the book, if it's just something that you think you'd be interested in. But hopefully it'll be a lot of people who've read the book and are interested in talking about it, asking questions, that sort of thing. And are you getting Chris in?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so Lisa, go ahead and give us a little bit of a background. Hi, Chris.
Finally found it.
Yay, hi.
So, Lisa, give us a little bit of your background first as a writer, and then about how the book in particular came about.
My background as a writer is pretty much non-existent. So I've always liked to write. I've always kept journal notes and things like that. But I just really felt like I wanted to write a book about all the little family stories that have come up over the years. You know, some of them from one generation to another, and others from the genealogy books that our relatives have put together. And I felt like those stories were really important to our family and needed to be written down in a way that people would want to read them, rather than just in a genealogy where, you know, she was born, she got married, she died. You know, I felt like there had to be more to it than that. And so I wanted to write something fictional, and that's how I started. I just started kind of jotting it down. I thought of the character of Shadow. I really struggled. I started writing the book, I don't know, 20 times, 30 times, and had little bits and pieces of it in this place and that place, not really being any kind of cohesive story, until a friend of mine that I worked with, her daughter, just for no good reason decided when she went into kindergarten she wasn't going to talk to the teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And she didn't. She'd talk up a storm at home, but when she went to school, she would not utter a word. And so they were thinking of putting her in special ed classes. They had taken her to speech therapists and psychologists and everything. And the end result was she just didn't want to talk when she was at school. And when she went from kindergarten to first grade, she started talking and hasn't stopped since. And she's reading, you know, at, you know, 3 grades above her level, and she's super smart. But for whatever reason, she went through that time. She didn't want to talk. And I thought, what a great place to start a story, because this is now a person that is just observing, just being there and just seeing, but not participating. And I thought that would be a nice way to kind of, you know, weave all of these stories together. So that's how it happened.
So I'm just curious, you know, I've kind of thought, as my kids tell me all these stories of things that they remember, you know, I think about things like when they stole their dad's wedding ring, and because they thought it was the one true ring, and hid it for a year, and I was so mad at him for losing his wedding ring, you know, things like this. I think together a book of all these stories, of all these wonderful memories and stories they tell me, but I would never think to just fictionalize them all. I would just tell them as a series of short scenes. And I wonder, did you try it that way at all?
You know, I wrote a lot of the short scenes, but I never thought about making them completely standalone stories.
Okay.
I felt like it was more important to, or more interesting to kind of bring them all together.
I do think it works well, but I just wonder, you know, if you had ever tried it that way and it just didn't seem to work. So I'll throw this out for everybody, but let's start with Lisa. Who's your favorite character and why?
My favorite character is Hulda.
Really?
She's like this awesome combination of my mom and my aunt and several of my grandparents, and she's just rough and yet soft all at the same time. So yeah, she totally, I loved writing about her.
Who else?
Somebody else.
I'd have to say Theophil. I mean, he's just pretty cool. He, you know, he befriends Shadow when she's just like a little thing, and puts her on his cow, and you know, and then she just becomes kind of a fixture around his place, and they're close enough neighbors where she can head over there, and it kind of, you know, I think if it weren't for Theophil, Shadow would not have grown up feeling any kind of sense of worth at all, because she was not getting that from Hulda, for sure. But that was a place of safety for her, and then she turned around and she did things for him, like got him out of the dark pit he was in.
Yes.
You know? So I love their relationship, and I obviously I was very, pretty upset with Theophil when he couldn't shake off the doldrums there, but I think overall he's just a really cool character.
Who else? Favorite characters?
I loved Shadow. It's not very often you get to read about somebody who's just so gentle.
Mhm.
Every interaction she had, every thought she had was just so gentle and kind. And if there was just this smidge of being unkind, she knew it and she wasn't comfortable with it. And the last time I read a book where the main character was just this gentle soul, was, I don't know when. And it was refreshing.
Yeah, I agree. She's very gentle and very conscientious of other people. And I think, Lisa, that's kind of an interesting character trait that we don't see in fictional characters at all.
And I almost wonder if it was believable.
Okay, so I was just thinking, I was going to ask if anyone knows anybody in real life who is that way.
I do.
And
Yeah.
I would have to say my mom was that way, just an ultimate sweet, never heard her say a negative word about anybody, and never, but also comes with that is the inability to stand up for yourself, and sometimes we get so upset with my mom because she wouldn't stand up for herself, so we can look back and say, she's gone now, but say, not a belligerent, not an angry bone in her body. And yet, sometimes we wish she had a little more of that. And I think we do a Shadow too, where we're going through. So it's funny because you might say, well, that's a character that's too perfect, but being too perfect is a flaw, right?
Yeah,
So
I didn't see
flaw.
her perfect because in a way she was very self-effacing too, which can be seen as, I don't know, I think in today's world that's not seen as a good character trait. But she didn't, she wasn't a Mary Sue, you know what I mean? She wasn't the most perfect at everything. And I mean, she did have this flaw. She couldn't or wouldn't speak. And that really set her apart and kept her probably from a life that she otherwise would have had. So to me, I kind of did see that she had some, at least, difficulties.
Well, in this day and age, it's always all about me. And so it was kind of nice to see a character that it was all about everybody else.
Yeah. I agree. I'm just turning up my volume. It was down a little bit. So anybody else, favorite characters?
I just like Shadow and how she interacted. Sorry, Christine.
No, that's all right. Carry on, Dana.
No, that was it. I just liked how everybody interacted with her, and I had some moments where you're like, doesn't anybody see what she's doing? And then somebody saw it and we're like, oh, good, okay.
I was really taken with that last chapter scene where the guys all ended up at Shadow's house during the snowstorm. I swear it felt like all of my uncles, if they had ended up at my house during the snowstorm. Their actions, the amount of food they consumed, the fact that she just kept making meal after meal. It just felt I just felt like I was right there in the heart of South Dakota during that whole. So those 3 guys or 4 guys that landed at her house, I really could relate to.
So Lisa, where did you come up with all the names?
All of the names were from our family history, our family genealogy. They're not all the right people, and some of the last names are just names from that area of South Dakota, so they don't necessarily fit. But for example, my great aunt was Regina, and Adeline is my grandmother, and Elmer is an uncle of mine, and Theophil is just a weird name that was in from both sides of the family, and even in Scott's family history there was a Theophil. So
that's funny because
I'd never heard the name before other than that.
It's biblical.
Theophilus?
Theophilus, lover of God, Theophilus.
Oh, okay. Okay, good, Chris.
Yeah. So Lisa, I kept meaning to tell you that even all the time that I had read your book and, you know, going through, hearing you read parts of it at the Writers Club, I have a grandma named Hulda,
You do?
actually. So, but somehow it wasn't connecting. Yeah, Hulda. Actually, Hulda is in my family tree too.
Oh, that's fantastic.
The German side, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, she's a great aunt as well. So yeah, they're all family names.
Tell us a few of the stories, and it sounds like the stories that you told weren't necessarily linked to the.
Yeah, correct. So most of the content in there is based on a real story, but isn't a real story. For example, the story of Theophil, in my family, there's a guy who, my great grandfather came to the US, bought a cow and walked the cow. Well, we don't know if in the story, we don't really know if he bought the cow in Russia and brought it with him, or if he bought it in the US, or where he got it. But he walked this cow all across the US, settled in South Dakota, built his homestead, wrote home to his fiance and said, you know, I'm ready for you, come. And she wrote back and said, no, I've changed my mind. And he wrote back and said, well, send your sister. So he sent the sister, and they had like 12 children.
Wow.
Now, I found out later that he actually, through another genealogy, through another aunt, he actually bought the cow in Minnesota. So he didn't really walk it that far. I mean, Minnesota to South Dakota in that time,
That's a long hike.
it's a journey, but he didn't walk it across the US. But he walked that cow from Minnesota to South Dakota, wrote home, said, son, you know, come. She said, no, send your sister. The sister came, but they only had 2 children.
Oh.
And one of those children had 12 children.
Okay.
So the real story isn't even as good as the passed down legend that my family always believed. But anyway, I was always intrigued by that because, you know, why does this sister come? You know, what could possibly possess her to come all that way and marry a guy that
He had a cow.
is the second best? You know?
Oh, that's great.
That's kind of been the joke on the internet lately, you know. I've got toilet paper, will you marry me?
Yeah. Right.
He had a cow, of course she would marry him. So one of the stories that I found particularly interesting and tragic that we talked about in the brothers, but maybe for everybody who's read this story, tell us the real story behind the drowning incident.
Yeah, I mean, I think Roxy maybe would be able to tell it even better than me because she's actually from the area where Amsterdam
Really?
is and where it happened.
Well,
But
so
are you related to anybody that drowned?
No, I'm not. But Andover, South Dakota isn't very large. So my father died when I was 8, and he is buried in the cemetery in Andover, South Dakota. And I don't remember the population there, but it's maybe
200
if even
on a good day?
30 years ago, 40 years ago, when he was buried there, it was even less. So the cemetery was also very small. And when we would go to visit his gravesite, we'd walk through the cemetery and see other relatives. But there was always this row of people who died on the same day. And the story that we'd always heard as kids and growing up was, yeah, this family was at a big family picnic, or some big picnic. Somebody's dentures went into the river, and everybody kept going into. First, they were trying to save the dentures because they were expensive and hard to come by. But then people started drowning, and the people who were trying to save them didn't know how to swim because it's South Dakota. and there aren't lakes, and nobody knows how to swim. And so I'm reading Lisa's book, and I get to that part, and I've never heard anybody else ever talk about this. I'm like,
Wow.
oh my God. I reach out to Lisa, like, do you know these people? But so it was a story I've been hearing since I was 8, and I'm older than that now.
That's
So
really cool.
we lived about 5 years in Webster, which is about, what would you say, maybe 30 miles from Andover. And I rode with a gentleman. I caught a ride to Minneapolis to a seminar with him, and on the way back, he started telling me about this story, and it was his relatives that were involved in some way. So he knew a lot about it, and then he named some of the people from the town, other people who we knew that, you know, it was a small town. So I asked around and found out a little bit more about it. And I just was so intrigued by that story. I felt like I needed some way to have Shadow have a relationship, but I wanted her not to have a normal life, because I felt like that might take away from the ending and from the whole point of the story if she were happy. And so yeah, sorry. So I thought this was a good way for her to have a love, and to have her have a really solid hero of a man to look up to and pine after. And so I wrote the drowning story. I looked it up online, and if you Google Amsden Dam drowning, you'll come up with all sorts of news articles and different things about the day. And it was a real thing that a woman lost her dentures. The people went after her. It was a real thing that they were going in, and people were trying to save each other. And then at the end, people were punching and fighting each other to keep them from going in to save their friends and family. And all of that whole scene really happened.
Yeah, and what really made that so memorable to me, you know, it brings to light this saying, truth is stranger than fiction, because I remember being in writers group, and I don't think I was the only one who was like, really? You know, they just kept going in one after another. Is this even believable? And that's when you said, it's not only believable, it's
Wow. Nobody told them to link arms and form a chain or anything like that. It's like, good grief, guys, get with it, will you?
You know, it was back before they had any kind of life-saving. And like Roxy said, in South Dakota, there's not a lot of water, a lot of lakes, so people didn't swim. It wasn't something that people really did. And I think because of the panic, and the cold water and things, I don't think anybody thought.
They just knew they wanted to save each other.
Well, I think, was the drop-off real then?
Yeah, the drop-off was real. It was a dam. And so can you imagine being, you know, 3 feet from someone who you love and know, and not grabbing them, you know, not trying to save them, and then, you know, they grab a hold like you do and drag you in, and I mean, just horrific.
You know, there was a tale when I lived in Minnesota. I went to Plymouth Congregational Church downtown, and way back in the early church history, there was a horrible drowning at Lake Calhoun, which is not called that anymore. I can't think of the new name. Thank you. At Lake Calhoun, where several church members were gone, and when it got retold in some sermon, and we're all like, Calhoun? How could people drown in Calhoun? But it was kind of explained to us the same way, that people didn't swim and didn't have the rescue techniques, and the same idea. And my memory is that would have been late 1800s.
Yeah.
And they probably had wool clothes on, you know, it was you know, really heavy, would drag them down, would be hard for even a swimmer to swim in full outfits.
Right. So Lisa, remind either if there's anyone here who hasn't read the book or hasn't read it recently, not that I'm naming any names, but just what Regina,
I've read it, but only in its manuscript form.
yeah,
But I haven't reread it.
yeah, it's been a little bit for me too. So Lisa, remind us what Regina's story is, that David didn't want it to be told, but what was the story?
What was the story that David didn't want to be told?
Regina's story.
She
What
could
was,
speak.
I'm sorry, what?
That she spoke. That story.
That shadow?
Oh, at the end, David said, "Don't tell the story." And it's it's of Regina who had a child out of wedlock.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
And then gave her away to some passing strangers. And my grandmother had my aunt out of wedlock. And I think she was 16 when she had Aunt Kay. And I don't know, she never really talked about it. We don't know who the father is. Even my Aunt Kay didn't know who her father was. And my mom told me that Grandma gave Aunt Kay away to some people that were passing through town, and her mom and dad had to go chase him down and get Aunt Kay back.
Wow.
And, you know, my grandparents were gone, and it was just such a scandal. Nobody talked about it, and including and especially my grandmother and my Aunt Kay.
Mm-hmm.
So it was kind of one of those stories that were whispered about in the family, but nobody spoke about it. And my grandmother was very proper, you know, went to church every Sunday and, you know, cleaned the church every Friday and made a cake for coffee and donuts. And I mean, she was extremely proper and super judgmental. You know, she was one of those old women in the nursing home that looked down and wondered what was wrong with all these wild kids and, you know, and their loud music. You know, she was just like totally straight-laced. And to have this scandal is just, it was just so out of character.
Mm-hmm. How old was the baby when they got it back? And how long had the baby been gone?
I think it was just maybe overnight, maybe not even overnight. And I think the baby was 2 or 3 years old. Yeah.
He kept it for 2 or 3 years, then just gave it away. But the parents found it right. Well, Kay, her.
Yeah, they found Kay, and I think she just the people were on their way to a neighbor's or something. So it's not like they had to, you know, race across the country.
Okay.
Somehow they knew where she was.
So I'm going to throw this out for everybody else. David thought that Regina's story should not be told, and Jack said it was important that it should be told. So who agrees with David and who agrees with Jack? Should it be told or shouldn't it?
I agree to be told.
Okay, why do you think it should be told?
I suppose accuracy.
Mm-hmm.
Not sweeping things under the rug, which is such an easy thing of that generation to do, recognizing a lot of my family and extended family and Lisa's characters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I certainly know some family stories where things were hidden until my parents got dementia and started spilling.
My cousins actually bought the book. And I lost sleep. I was just like sick to my stomach thinking, this is a huge family secret. And now I've just exposed it. Even though I changed the names and the place and things were a little different, they would recognize it for sure.
What did they think, Lisa?
You know, I don't know. On Facebook, they, you know, posted a picture. I got your book, Lisa. And I'm like, great. Let me know how you like it. and I've been ghosted ever since. So
Oh,
either they didn't read it, which is quite possible. I mean, that they just didn't read it, or they read it and didn't like it, or they read it and are never going to talk to me again. Who knows?
Well, you know, I think Jack's comment was very important, though, what he said. I mean, his justification for actually putting it out there was, you know, that people needed to treat people in that situation very differently to the way that they did at that time. That rather than creating this atmosphere of rejection, this atmosphere where Regina was so rejected and so despondent that she was in the place where she felt like giving the poor baby away, they should have treated her in a way that made her feel that she could keep the baby, nurture it, and bring it up. And so Jack's point, I think, in saying, no, they should be here so that people learn that they don't treat people that way. I think that is a good, if you like, a good reason for keeping the story in there so people can understand what it does to people when they reject them in such a way. And I think that, to me, is a good reason for keeping it in. And his point, you know, that was made by Lisa there through the character is a very powerful one.
Oh, there's Susie. I knew she was coming.
Now we have two Susans.
Hi, finally here.
Hey,
Hi.
Susie.
Nice to meet you.
Now we got
Nice to meet
Susan
you
Adler, right,
too.
on here, which is interesting.
Yeah, but in the book, when is that scene? Is that in the 40s or the 30s?
60s.
In the 60s.
60s. So still it's decades before its time where people would actually really say that.
It would be pretty scandalous back
Still
then,
pretty
even.
scandalous, yeah.
Yeah. Even now, I mean, the whole story. I mean, imagine if somebody gave your child away.
Yeah, and I think we were talking about, like, how do you present, like, in the time when that was going on with Regina, she was probably suffering from postpartum depression, which they didn't even know about. And, you know, how do you write about that in an era when they didn't understand it? And then even the 60s later, when they're talking about revealing that story, they didn't quite understand it either, right? So I think you had to kind of look into when the ideas about postpartum depression even started to be discussed and understood.
I like how that story was told, but you had the family in complete support of her. It's like, okay, this thing happened. We feel scandalized, but we are stronger and bigger than that. We're just going to hold our heads high and go on about our business. And you know, that was consistent with that situation. And I like how you did that with the family. You know, even the little brothers were in support, and you know, everybody was doing the right thing.
Don't you think that's kind of how families are, though? You know, like my family, you know, I can say something about my brother and roll my eyes, and you know, we can all be talking and but by God, if one of you says something against him, I'm coming at you, you know.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, you know, because Regina was such a pet of Hulda's, of course, you know. And then sometimes you might, you know, knowing Hulda, I kind of expected her to just like go the other way, like if she was crossed. But that was interesting that, yeah, they did all support her.
So, Lisa, how did, or for anyone, you know, your opinions too, how did Johanna help shape the events that led to Regina's unhappiness and her shame?
If you guys remember, Johanna was the city girl that moved to the country and ultimately died in the plague with her family, but died of the Blue Death with her family. But she was really a special friend to Regina and really was forming her and trying to make her a lady.
So what was the question again, Laura? Sorry.
How did Johanna help shape those events that led to Regina's unhappiness and shame?
She was pushing her to, she was pushing her to grow up too fast, right? And it was just kind of a situation where nobody really realized that was happening, but it seemed like a a safe relationship, but as it turned out, maybe it wasn't so much. But go ahead, Christine.
Well, I had a thought about it. I was so sad that Shadow was considered dispensable and could be sent to the house where they were dealing with this
Right.
awful virus that we all know about right now.
Yeah.
And so she could be sent daily to bring food in and so on. So I was wondering how Regina would have felt about knowing that her older sister was considered dispensable to go over and see her friend. It just made for some interesting dynamics. Lisa, thoughts on that? I mean, because you kind of circle
Well,
back to the end of the book that
I
it was
think
so
that,
important Shadows.
yeah, I think that the family didn't really see Shadow as a member of the family.
Yeah.
Regina didn't really think of her as a sister, but more maybe a nanny.
Yeah. Which is why the book ended so sweet, was when the guys heard she was valuable.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there were a number of young girls who got put into that situation. Basically, their families couldn't support all the kids they had, and so if you had a teenager who was able to work out, as they would say, and go be a live-in at somebody else's family, then that could happen. But they were in this. Yeah, they were basically a servant, but maybe a little bit higher than a servant. But what was their role? They weren't part of the family. And I think that's basically what Shadow was her whole life, from, the youngest age, which is really, really sad. But there were a lot of girls that happened to.
Mm-hmm.
So I did think that was interesting. You referred, Lisa, at the beginning to Hulda as being kind of very good-hearted, even though she was kind of rough. And so she and Shadow do have this relationship where, yeah, Shadow isn't really the daughter, and yet Hulda always takes care of her. I'm curious. I had a hard time seeing Hulda as a loving or kind person. So I was surprised by your description of her. I'm curious about what other people thought about that relationship between the two of them, and especially why Shadow was so willing to accept Hulda's blatantly unfair treatment of her.
I can say again, to me, Hulda and Shadow, their relationship was much the way I understood my grandma's relationship to my mom. Raised in a small town of Emery, South Dakota, somewhat close to Webster. And my mom was just another mouth to feed, and there were chores to be done. And my grandma, as I knew it, just wasn't a kind, sensitive soul. She was busy
It's about
killing the
Lisa.
chicken to get the meal on the
Lisa's
table
book.
for the kids. Yeah.
Well, and
Is that,
it's 3 meals all day long, all the laundry, cleaning the house, and it's hard labor.
Yeah. And canning enough to last all winter when we can hardly last 2 weeks to make sure we've got enough food in our house
Yeah.
to keep us from going out. Yeah. This is an interesting time to go through now to compare back to some of Lisa's stories.
Yeah.
How did they prepare for an entire winter with enough food with a huge family?
That's so true. Can I go with Susan?
Yeah, Susan. We can't see you though.
I don't know why I have my it's a chroma cam. I don't know, is there a way to let's see, start video? Aha. Okay.
Yay, there you are.
There I am.
Hi.
I'm really sorry that I wasn't in on the very beginning of the call, because I think that how the whole relationship between Hulda and Shadow developed on the ship with the family that disappeared. Did you guys go into any more of the theories of why that happened?
No.
No, but Laura has been upset with me since the first moment I started reading this in writers group, because I didn't solve that mystery.
Okay.
there was no way for you to solve it.
I think it's actually more powerful that we don't know. That the loss, the double orphan, we're now put in the same role as the orphan. We don't know what happened to them. So we share her vision of confusion of who am I? Why did this happen to me? What happened? And so that I love that part of it, but I also would love, I've spun off so many, probably 3 different scenarios that make me feel better.
Okay, tell us what they are.
Yeah, I'd be curious.
Well, it was kind of a murder, almost like an accident suicide. Like even like something happened, one of them fell overboard, the other one jumped because it was so impulsive they couldn't do it, and so they couldn't live without that other person,
Like
forgetting about the baby.
Kind of like
Or
like what,
pardon?
Susan?
Hi, Susan.
like the way people went after the false teeth.
Yeah, nice.
Right. So to me, I love the fact that we were bereft just like she was. We were left in the dark just like she was. So that part I thought was a good technique as far as giving me an immediate compassion to Shadow's unknowingness. But I think there's such an interesting dynamic with all mothers, and maybe because I'm more like Hulda than I'd care to believe, that it is so demanding to be a mother. It is so overwhelming, and the kids, no matter what age, are always going to want more. There's never enough, no matter how many kids or what the roles are. And so that feeling of never enough, but that Shadow had no other choice, it just kept coming back with loyalty and devotion and trust that this woman would keep helping her. And that to me was the poignant part about their relationship. But I definitely think there's also, again, I'm projecting, that Hulda liked the importance of being important to this little girl. She liked that role of being the supreme helper, and she wasn't connected by birth. So that was kind of my relationship. But yeah, they were definitely much more pragmatic in those days and not a lot of spoiling.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just thought, another person might have actually like adopted this girl, and said, okay, you are our daughter now, however this came about, but that wasn't the way they did it. And part of it might have been that Hulda was pregnant at the time with her first baby. And so she wanted to devote her affections to her own child at that time. So I wonder if it had happened in a different time frame, even for Hulda, if that could have changed.
That's true.
There were certainly moments that I tried to write in where Shadow understood that Hulda cared about her. There were certain, little times where, Regina had to come and tell Shadow when she first moved out, you have to come home. Hulda isn't the same without you. And then Hulda sits down and has coffee with her. There's little things like that, or at church, when they got older, they sat in the same pew together. And so I tried to bring that out a little bit, that beneath that crusty exterior, Hulda did have a soft spot for Shadow and did appreciate what she went through.
Too little, too late.
I have a comment about Hulda's the way she had her white cake recipe that she wouldn't share with anybody. Oh. To me, that's reminded me of about 17 of my relatives. And I could just see the teasing at the family reunion, that they think whatever they're bringing is the best and they aren't going to share the recipe. It's a South Dakota thing. It made me laugh.
Yeah. That was fun.
There was a lot of my aunt in all of that, the white cake recipe, and the fact that you can't serve cinnamon at a funeral. People want something comforting, and that was a real conversation that my mom and aunt had. And then
was it too spicy?
I don't know. Who doesn't love cinnamon? Come on.
But it might have been something like too pleasurable or something, and you were somehow not supposed to imbibe pleasure at such a grief-stricken time. We don't do that.
Enough.
That's true. I remember one time sitting with my mom and my aunt was talking about her new daughter-in-law, and they had gone to visit, and her daughter-in-law didn't have supper on the table for the men because they were out building a shed or something, and she wasn't prepared, and my cousin was going to barbecue that night, so she didn't have anything planned. And my aunt was just appalled that these men have been working all day and they're going to be hungry, and she didn't do anything. She said, well, the least we can do is make them some, you have all those apples there, we can at least make them a crisp. And she said, then she started looking through the recipe box, and I said, what are you doing now? And she said, I'm looking for the crisp recipe. And my aunt had these huge eyes and this really, she was really farsighted. Can you believe she needed a recipe for a crisp? And my mom was like, oh yeah, agreeing. And we got in the car, and I said to my mom, what the hell? What was going on with that? Do you know how to make a crisp without a recipe? And my mom said,
Lisa, I have to tell you this story because it's so typical. I think it's typical of the age too. When I was first married, and this is like 1989, no, it's not the 1950s or anything. My mom took me to the grocery store. I'm like 20 years old. I was a music major, working on my degree in music. And she says, okay, you need molasses. She's just, sliding things into the cart. She puts in molasses. I said, what am I going to do with molasses? She said, you're going to make molasses cookies. I'm like, I play trombone. I do not bake. I especially don't bake molasses cookies. I'm never going to make molasses cookies. Like, no, you need molasses. And we just kept going in a circle. But why? Because you need to make molasses cookies. No, I don't. I think that's very typical of a certain day and age, that this is the way things were done, and that's that. So I want to go back to the cow. You wrote about Lily the cow at the beginning, and then towards the end too. Did she represent something?
what does everybody think? Did that cow add anything to the story?
Particularly.
That was Theophil's cow, right?
Yeah, Theophil had the cow that he walked across, and he had just kind of a love affair with this cow.
And I think that's what the cow was about, at least at the beginning, was showing what a big part Theophil had.
It also kind of reminds me of a joke, though.
What was the ending of the cow? Move ahead to where's the second time you talk about the cow?
At the very end, as they're sitting around in the blizzard, and they're all older.
And they're all talking.
They talk about the cow, and Elmer says he heard his grandfather talk about this cow before, but he thought that it was he called it Lily, and he thought it was a girlfriend, the way he talked about it.
Yeah, I think there's something about, like, the farmer and the farmer mindset, and like they get really close to certain of these animals. My mom was that way with certain of her cows, so I do think that they form these relationships with their animals. And to me, it's kind of part of that pioneer personality. Is if it was a symbol, that's what I think it is, of that committed farming pioneer personality. Yeah.
And I also think there's, well, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say it's the first cow too. So anything that's first fruit, anything that's the beginning, the foundation, in that sense, it's the first one in the new land. In that sense, I guess it has a certain significance.
Yeah.
For me, a cow represents so much more of the whole motherhood, the whole Mother Earth, the mana of milk. And Theophil wanted a family so badly that this was he knew that this creature would sustain he and his family for a long, long time. And that relationship was like so important. So there were such connections of love and throughout the novel that I loved, that I was so with.
Yeah. One of the things I really liked about it, I remember when I was giving it to Roxy, I'm like, it's just a series of really good stories, and you like the people, and it's a nice read. And afterwards, I'm thinking about it, because Shadow can't talk, she has to seek answers or observe more. She's not able to say, what about this or what about this? And it's sort of, she lets the people be as they are. And we get to observe more about them. And therefore, I think they become even more likable. Because I think, you know, some of the characters, it would be so easy to totally write them off, you know, when you met them. But, you know, as she interacted with them, you know, she saw other things. You know, another thing you in here, and again, I didn't read it. I mean, I read it before I gave to Roxy, and that's like right after it came out. So I don't know the guy's name, but the guy who killed himself.
Oh, so there was Kermit and Pius.
Right.
Mhm. That was
right.
interesting.
And dealing with that and the way she would just let them be and see them, you know, it gave you a little more grace towards them, I guess. So that's one of the things I like.
Yeah, because both of them were pretty troubled, you know.
If you
But yeah,
remember the story of Kermit and Pius, Kermit was Nicholas's brother. So it would have been Shadow's brother-in-law if Nicholas hadn't drowned. And he came to the village with Pius, who he met on the ship coming over. And they had a relationship, you know, good friends, maybe more, we don't know. And they lived together and fought sometimes, but Kermit, Pius was killed by a train in a blizzard, and Kermit blamed himself for it. And then the following year, he was killed by a train in a blizzard. And he left a note at the end, so we know that, you know, at first it was a question, but because of the note, we
Assume.
we feel sure that he planned it, that he committed suicide.
So, Lisa, were you know, when Kermit talks about his haze that he gets, were you basically kind of intimating some kind of bipolar, some kind of mental issue that he had? I mean, Pius seemed to be a pretty normal kind of guy generally. I don't seem to see anything with him, but with Kermit, you know, it seems right from the early days, from the fire in his old country, and even people who notice he has a funny manner about him, they keep talking about him when he talks about his own issues. Are you intimating some kind of either bipolar or some kind of mental issue that he suffers under?
Yes, Chris. Yep, that's exactly. I felt like he suffered definitely from depression, but also maybe some hidden rage, some hidden anger issues, whether that's bipolar or not. He definitely had some problems. And I tried to write it. I don't know how well it came across that Kermit was gay, and that he had this internal struggle with himself, that he didn't like that part of himself, and so he was raging against that, and that was part of the struggle that kind of brought him down into this depression, is that he'd realized he can't change himself.
I didn't get that, but yeah, okay.
Yeah, I did get that, Lisa, and to me, you did present it from that South Dakota vantage point, that nobody knew how to talk about it. You're expected to go to church every Sunday, but yet then you feel like you're condemned. So this weird pull that people would go through in that generation, that of course they would start to go mad. Yeah.
I think this brings us to the point that there's really an awful lot of tragedy in this book. Do anybody find that made the book too heavy?
Not really.
I told Lisa on Saturday when we were talking that it's a good reminder for what we're going through right now. Because yes, there was a lot of tragedy, but it kind of reminds us how lucky we are by comparison, even during this bizarre pandemic. You know, Lisa described what it was like for what was cholera at the time. What did you call it, Lisa? The blue
the Blue Death.
Blue Death? Yeah, I'd forgotten that term. It was a tough time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think, I do this podcast called Books and Brews, and one of our first guests was a man, actually my boss at one of the music schools I teach at. He comes from Russia, and he was talking about Russian literature and how it tends to be very dark, very heavy. He said, American novels and movies, especially in our day and age, tend to have the happy ending. Everybody works hard, gets their reward, lives happily ever after. And he said in Russian literature, it's more like the kid gets eaten by the wolf in the forest. Everybody dies. But he said there's a purpose to that you learn, and that kids might hear these dark fairy tales. You go, oh, yeah, life doesn't always turn out well, and there's this difference that maybe when you grow up on that sort of thing, you don't expect life to be perfect. You get that it's going to be dark and heavy, whereas sometimes in our day and age, we expect it all to be perfect, and then we get upset when it isn't. I didn't find it heavy. I found it, like Christine said, a very good reminder that life does have some really rough spots, and that's going to happen. Anybody else?
Well, and that Shadow was able to, she had the resiliency to get through it and to find something good even within the tragedies, and to see how people can support each other through those tragedies. And I think that's a characteristic of most of the small pioneer communities, right? You have to draw that strength from each other in the hard times, which is weird with this pandemic, right? Because we don't get to socialize during a hard time, right? But I think that's one of the uplifting parts. Yeah, show the hard times, but then show how people support each other through those times.
I loved just how even she was. She was unflappable. No matter what was happening, she was this even-keeled person. And the beauty of her was her listening, because we forget to listen. And so many problems can be resolved quickly by just shutting down our responses and just listening. And to me, the book was this gentle reminder, just be quiet for a minute. Listen to what the other person is saying. And so much more good happens that way.
I think that's part of why Shadow was successful at seeing the good in people, because she didn't talk. She wasn't busy thinking about how she was going to reply. And so she could let them just sort of open up. And that's why we see the good in these people, even when, as you said, Lisa, or somebody said, they might not all be people that you love. And yet through her eyes, we sort of do. So Lisa,
I'd like to bring up one other topic, and maybe you guys already talked about it before I was on, but Lisa had such a gentle way about herself and her great storytelling capability. But through this book, I really found myself understanding more and more with deeper compassion how men feel about things. I think that sometimes the way I was raised, or feeling like women never get heard enough or whatever, the fact that she could actually be silent enough and allow men to share the depth of their souls was something that I had not really been privy to. And maybe it just opened my eyes a lot to more of the gentleness of men in general. And that was very touching to me, that when I finished that book, I just thought, wow, I don't think I give men enough credit for being whole human beings. And I'm too quick to discount or flashback or feel superior, like I've got the emotional coordinates and they don't. And I thought there were a lot of emotional coordinates in all those men in very different ways. And I really enjoyed that.
That's awesome, Susie.
That's a very good point, Susan.
Yeah, and maybe it's partially because women have the tendency to be better verbal communicators, right? And so in a presence of a woman, a man could feel intimidated about his ability to express himself, but a man wouldn't have to feel that way in front of Shadow, right? And so
Right.
there's no competition for this, who's the better verbal communicator. They can just communicate as they would and not feel like they're lesser talented at it. Yeah.
Well, I think they felt safe too, because as the book for the blurb says, when somebody doesn't talk, people feel like whatever they say is safe. And so I think these men felt that they could say anything and it wasn't going to go further. And so I think this brings up a great question. You know, we had talked earlier about Shadow's sense of worth. Do you think that by the end of the book, she realized her sense of worth, or realized that she had worth?
I think had the scene, the snowstorm scene with the 4 men, if that event wouldn't have taken place, she might not have ever known.
Mhm.
But because that did happen, and it was a slow realization. It didn't happen immediately. It was just all of those conversations building on each other throughout that event.
Mhm.
But otherwise, I don't think she would have ever known.
Yeah, I never felt that she didn't see worth in herself, although I do think that conversation changed her perspective and maybe enhanced, you know, a very conscious sense that what she had to offer really mattered.
But I don't think she ever thought negatively of herself. It didn't seem that way to me. She was.
That's what I'm saying. I totally.
But at the beginning, she is saying, you know, I'm writing down these stories, but I don't really know why, and I don't have a particular audience for them. But she feels like God is compelling her to do this, and then it turns out at the very, very end that, oh, the reason why was exactly because this all turned out into an affirming session for her. And that was not her intent in writing these stories, but it turned back to bless her. And that's what I think is so cool. And it's like, well, yeah, God does that, you know. He leads us into something that we think we don't know why this is happening or who I'm doing this for, and then he uses it to bless us, turn around and bless us, you know, and partially for the obedience that we did. So I just love that part, how it all comes out at the end.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, I think she starts off saying, doesn't she, you know, I don't know if people see me, but the end ends up saying, I do matter.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting to me. I mean, there are just some things through the whole course of the story. When she receives Nicholas's journal, for example, that is a real point where she hears how Nicholas has been talking about her, that she's been spoken of in such a way that, and written back home about, that is very affirming for her, even though obviously Nicholas is gone now. That's something that really brings up her kind of sense of worth and builds it up to her. You know, it's interesting for me, Lisa, that you didn't, I mean, even right at the end when those guys are reading these words, and obviously David knows she can speak. He's the only one in that group who does. But then they all read, oh, so you can speak. And then she doesn't say, ta-da, yes, I can. Ha-ha. You know, she still keeps silent. That to me is very interesting, that she didn't speak even then, you know, even though it's known that she does speak, that she can speak. That to me was an interesting choice of yours, to let her stay silent. I mean, I understand in one sense that after all these years, it was her choice never to speak again. And yeah, you brought me to tears when you wrote that little piece at the end when David is speaking to her after the drowning and says, you know, he recognized that her voice drowned at the same time as Nicholas drowned that day. That was a very beautiful, I thought that was put very beautifully. But then after all those years.
I was crying when I wrote it, and I was crying when I read it back.
When I read it, love, I'll tell you. But then at the end, when all of that is done and all those years have passed, and there she is as an old lady with all these old men around, clearing the snow. And then, ta-da, the great reveal comes. Guess what, guys? I can speak. She doesn't speak. That was very interesting to me that you chose to do it that way. Why was that?
I think that, well, one thing is physically, she hasn't spoken in, years and years and years. So physically, I think it would have been unbelievable for her to be able to talk.
Okay.
Because remember, she had to talk to the farm animals.
Sure,
and
I
she
remember
really
she
worked it
practiced,
up
yeah.
before she could speak. But then I think she really felt that Nicholas should be the only one to hear her talk. And I think that over time she just felt she didn't need to talk.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of, don't you think it's maybe like an alcoholic who just chooses not to drink? And now you've got cancer and you're given, 6 months to live. And you think, well, I could drink, who cares now? I'm going to die anyway, but they choose not to. They choose to die sober. Maybe it's something like that where she's decided this is who I am. This is how I'm living my life. And I'm going to choose to remain silent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it certainly is her identity now, her silence. And I guess it's less threatening for those guys to know or to feel that she's a silent person, because now they know that she can speak. All the things they've said to her in confidence all those years, they now know she could have told everybody about them.
Yeah.
Oops.
And now that she started talking, who knows what she'll say.
But obviously she hasn't, and she chooses not to. And I guess in one sense, there's also that security that comes from knowing, no, these things, whatever you said to me, they remain silent with me because I will remain silent too. I take maybe something from that also, that she has held those things inside of her, and she will remain to hold those things inside of her too. So yeah, interesting choice, Yeah, good.
Before we start to wrap up, does anybody else have any questions for Lisa or comments? Anything they want to talk about the book that we haven't brought up?
Well, I had one other thing, Lisa. Sorry to hug the stage here a little, hug the squares. The other thing was, if she's such a hottie, why didn't she get more offered?
Do we have any ice?
I think, Chris, because she was such an oddball.
Okay, yeah, that's a good reason.
She's in a small little town, so everybody knows her, and Hulda kind of set her up as this tag along that didn't quite belong and didn't quite fit in, and she doesn't talk. So when Nicholas comes, it's a surprise.
Because he's the new kid from out of town, so he doesn't have all the baggage that other people have put on her.
Nobody really saw her before as a woman, as somebody to desire, until he came to town and took a look at her.
But David gets jealous there, right?
That is true. Yeah. David had the little shine for it.
I think it speaks to the power of the tongue, for good or bad, that in a way Hulda set her up for failure in that way. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a sad comment.
Yeah, for sure.
If I could start again, one thing that struck me was just your ability